I had never felt smaller in a room full of people I grew up trusting. Dinner was supposed to be ordinary. The family gathered around the table laughing, sharing stories, pretending everything was perfect. But as soon as I took my seat, the air shifted. My sister's eyes met mine across the table, glinting with that familiar smugness, the same smugness that had haunted me for months. She didn't just lie about me. She painted me as someone I wasn't, whispered false stories about my life, my choices, my reputation. And now, surrounded by everyone I loved, those lies hovered in the air like smoke, filling every corner with doubt and judgment. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of shock, humiliation, and a quiet, burning anger that refused to be silenced. The contrast between us was impossible to ignore. She sat there effortlessly charming everyone, commanding attention, her confidence almost tangible, while I felt exposed, invisible, the target of her carefully crafted deception. Every laugh, every sideways glance from a cousin or family friend seemed to underscore the narrative she had spun about me. It was as though the world had tilted, and I was watching from the edge, powerless to intervene. And yet, underneath the surface of my shame, a small voice whispered, reminding me that I knew the truth. I knew the real me, the me that she had tried to erase. The tension was electric. I could feel the way my parents, unthinkingly, nodded along to her version of events, validating a story that was both false and cruel. My hands clenched under the table, knuckles whitening as I tried to steady my racing thoughts. Every instinct screamed at me to erupt, to demand justice, but something held me back. I realized that this was bigger than a single outburst. This was a moment that could either define me as someone silenced or someone who would finally reclaim control. The stakes felt monumental, far beyond this dinner, far beyond my sister's lies. As the conversation meandered from trivialities to personal anecdotes, I noticed the subtle signs of doubt flickering in the faces around the table. A cousin raised an eyebrow at one of her statements. A friend hesitated before laughing at her joke. These tiny cracks were like sparks in dry grass, signaling that the truth had not been completely buried. And in that moment, the seed of resolve took root in me. I would not allow her to continue shaping reality unchecked. I would not be humiliated in silence. But even as I prepared myself mentally for the confrontation to come, memories of the past surfaced unbidden. There had always been little things, small manipulations, moments where she had twisted situations to make me look foolish or incapable. I remembered childhood gatherings where I was sidelined, family conversations where my words were misrepresented. Those early instances had planted the framework for what was now unfolding, and suddenly, the present moment made sense. This was never just about the lies at dinner. It was about a pattern, a history that had gone unnoticed, unchallenged, until now. Tonight, however, everything felt poised on a knife's edge. The room was full of laughter and warmth on the surface, but underneath, currents of tension pulsed strongly, ready to erupt. I could feel my heart pounding in rhythm with the anticipation, a strange mix of fear and determination. I was ready to face her, to confront the deception. But I also knew that whatever happened next would ripple far beyond this table. One lie had the power to unravel so many threads, and I had to be prepared to take control before it was too late. Tonight, the game was changing, and I would not be the powerless player anymore. Growing up, our family always seemed picture-perfect from the outside. Holiday photos, birthday celebrations, and casual gatherings were full of smiles, laughter, and the illusion of harmony. To anyone looking in, we were the kind of family people envied, close, supportive, and unshakable. But behind closed doors, the truth was far more complicated. Subtle favoritism, quiet rivalries, and manipulations existed like a low hum beneath the surface, unnoticed by most, but deeply felt by those who knew how to listen. And I had learned early on that in our family, appearances mattered more than honesty. Charm often outweighed substance, and the cleverest among us could control perception with frightening ease. My sister had always been the golden child, at least in the eyes of everyone but me. From the outside, she was charming, accomplished, and seemingly flawless. She had a knack for making people believe whatever she wanted, a talent that often left me questioning my own memory, my own perspective. I remembered school achievements subtly twisted to highlight her superiority, birthday games where my successes were minimized or ignored, and family dinners where her stories always took center stage while mine were dismissed or mocked. Those moments at the time felt minor, just the background noise of sibling rivalry, but over the years, they had accumulated into a pattern I could no longer ignore. Even my parents, people I had trusted to be fair, had their own biases, often unconsciously favoring her over me. Praise flowed more freely in her direction. Small indulgences were offered without thought, and mistakes on her part were forgiven with a casual wave, while I was scrutinized for the slightest misstep. I tried to tell myself that love was complicated, that these moments didn't define our family. But deep inside, I carried a quiet resentment, a sense that my own worth was being measured on someone else's scale. Those early experiences shaped not only my understanding of my sister, but also the way I navigated every interaction, learning to tread carefully in a minefield of perception and control. And then there were the friends and extended family, oblivious to the subtle manipulations that ran through every gathering. They saw the laughter, the shared stories, and the warmth, never noticing the small tensions that lingered just below the surface. I learned to hide my frustration, to smile when slighted, to nod when ignored. It became second nature, a survival tactic in a house where appearances mattered more than truth. I began to see the way my sister could tilt reality, bending the narrative to suit her whims. And though I tried to resist, I often found myself silently complicit, unwilling to expose her, fearing the backlash or simply not knowing how to respond. Looking back, I can pinpoint the moment when her subtle games escalated into something more dangerous. A lie here, a twisted story there. Each small falsehood seemed inconsequential in isolation, but over time, they began to build a web around me. Friends and family started to see me through the lens she had painted, a distorted version of my reality. And yet, at the time, I told myself it was harmless, that it would pass, that love in a family meant enduring minor injustices with grace. But beneath my calm exterior, resentment simmered. I was learning that charm could be weaponized, and control over perception could be far more damaging than outright cruelty. The contrast between the public harmony and private tension had shaped not only our family relationships but my own understanding of trust, loyalty, and self-worth. Every compliment my sister received, every favor granted to her while mine was overlooked, was a reminder that in our family, perception often overrode reality. And as I prepared for what would become that fateful dinner, I realized just how much power her lies could wield. This wasn't simply sibling rivalry anymore. This was a deliberate manipulation that had grown unchecked, creating consequences that would ripple through our relationships, our reputations, and the very fabric of our family dynamic. I could already feel the weight of the tension that had been building for years, a tension rooted in favoritism, subtle deception, and misrepresentation. Every gathering, every shared story, every casual interaction had been shaped by her hand, and now it had reached a point where the truth could no longer be ignored. The stage was set, the cracks had formed in the facade of our perfect family, and it was only a matter of time before those lies collided with reality. What had once seemed like harmless games and minor slights now carried real consequences, consequences that would force confrontation and, ultimately, demand reckoning. I never expected the truth to hit me like this. Not in the middle of what should have been an ordinary evening. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the constant pressure of family scrutiny, when a message caught my eye, a forwarded email from a mutual friend that I had never intended for anyone else to see. As I read it, my stomach dropped. Every word of that message contradicted the narrative my sister had spent months spreading, every detail exposing the web of lies she had carefully constructed. My pulse quickened, and for a moment I could hardly breathe. How could someone I trusted so intimately twist my life into a story that was completely false? The humiliation came next, sudden and sharp. Moments later, During a casual conversation at dinner, my sister mentioned the very topic of that email, smugly embellishing it in front of everyone, clearly expecting laughter and agreement. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks as the family chuckled, unaware of the truth I now held in my hands. The contrast between her confidence and my shock was jarring. She sat there, smiling and charming, completely unaware, or perhaps deliberately ignorant, of the evidence that proved her deceit. Meanwhile, I felt exposed, like a character in a cruel play written by someone else. The anger surged, mingling with disbelief, leaving me trembling yet strangely focused. Every word she spoke was now magnified, every gesture, every laugh, felt like a provocation. I watched her manipulate the narrative effortlessly, twisting perceptions, feeding assumptions, while I silently held the proof that shattered everything she claimed. It was maddening to see how easily the family accepted her version of events, how quickly people were willing to doubt me, to trust her lies over my integrity. The betrayal cut deep, not only because of the falsehoods themselves, but because of how cleverly they were deployed. A slow erosion of my credibility in the eyes of the people I loved. As the evening progressed, the tension became unbearable. I could feel the split in the room, the sister I had grown up with, the one everyone admired, standing above me in perception, and the reality I now knew, the reality that she had worked tirelessly to conceal. Every joke she made, every casual remark, now felt like a dagger, a reminder that I had been misrepresented in the most public and personal ways. And yet, underneath the humiliation, something shifted. The anger that had threatened to consume me became a strange source of strength. I realized that knowledge was power. I had the truth, undeniable and concrete, and it was only a matter of time before it came to light. I remembered past incidents with startling clarity. There had been other moments when her subtle misrepresentations had put me in uncomfortable positions, moments I had dismissed as misunderstandings or minor sibling rivalries. But now looking back, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't harmless. It was deliberate, targeted, and carefully calculated. And the realization of that fact sparked a determination I hadn't felt before, a determination to reclaim my voice, my reputation, and the respect that had been stripped away so quietly over the years. Even as I sat there, outwardly calm, I began plotting the next steps in my mind. I would not confront her recklessly. This was a battle of wits, strategy, and timing. Each smile I gave, each nod was measured, hiding the storm beneath. I thought of the ways I could reveal the truth at the perfect moment, ensuring that her carefully constructed illusion would shatter spectacularly. The humiliation I had endured would be reversed, and this time, the narrative would be mine to control. The more I considered the possibilities, the sharper my focus became. This was no longer about minor slights or childhood rivalries. The lies had real consequences, affecting relationships, reputations, and the trust I had placed in my family. I could feel the tension building, the emotional pressure coiling like a spring ready to release. The contrast between her arrogance and my integrity had never been more apparent, and I knew that the upcoming confrontation would demand precision, patience, and courage. By the end of the evening, I was no longer the person who had walked into that room overwhelmed by confusion and betrayal. I had been transformed by the revelation, steeled by the knowledge of her deceit, and fueled by a quiet, burning resolve. The conflict was no longer abstract. It was immediate, personal, and unavoidable. One lie had uncovered a cascade of manipulations, and it was clear that the only way forward was to face them head-on. The stakes were higher than ever, and as the family dispersed and the evening wound down, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The lies had been exposed to me, and now it was time for the truth to demand its place. The days following that dinner were unbearable. Everywhere I turned, I could feel the lingering effects of my sister's lies, like invisible threads pulling at the edges of my relationships. Friends and family treated me differently, their smiles polite but hesitant, their glances loaded with unasked questions. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me it felt like every interaction was a reminder that my credibility had been undermined. The contrast between her effortless control and my growing frustration was impossible to ignore. She seemed untouchable, gliding through conversations, charming everyone, while I was left carefully navigating a minefield of assumptions, doubts, and whispers. Every family gathering became a test of endurance. I would sit at the table, hearing her casually retell incidents, each embellishment carefully designed to cast me in a negative light. Cousins would laugh, friends would nod, and parents would offer reassuring glances toward her, as though validating her version of events. Each laugh, each glance was like a pinprick to my pride, fueling the fire of frustration that was building inside me. And yet, I refused to confront her prematurely. I knew that acting out of pure emotion would give her the upper hand. I needed patience, strategy, and the right moment to reveal the truth. The psychological toll was exhausting. I found myself replaying every conversation, every gathering, analyzing her words and gestures for hidden intentions. I noticed how she would subtly discredit me in front of others, dropping half-truths that sounded innocent unless you knew the full story. She would laugh just a bit too loudly at a story about me, as if signaling to the room that I was not to be trusted. Even when I tried to speak, she would interrupt, redirect, or diminish my words, leaving me second-guessing whether my perspective mattered at all. It was relentless, and yet with each slight, my resolve hardened. I realized that I was not powerless. I just needed to be cunning, deliberate, and calculated. I began to experiment with small, subtle moves of my own, a quiet psychological counterattack. If she mentioned one of her false claims in front of a family friend, I would ask a single innocuous question that seeded doubt without revealing my hand. If she laughed at one of her twisted stories, I would smile politely, letting her arrogance build, knowing that the higher she soared, the harder she would fall when the truth came out. It was a slow, delicate game of leverage, a silent battle of perception where every glance, every word, and every reaction was part of a larger strategy. Each day, I became more aware of her patterns, more capable of predicting her moves, and more confident that I could turn her manipulations against her. Even in the moments when frustration threatened to consume me, I reminded myself of my integrity. My sister's power was built on deception, but mine was grounded in truth. That contrast became my compass. Where she relied on charm, I relied on clarity. Where she manipulated reality to her advantage, I observed, documented, and prepared. Every interaction with her, every subtle jab or comment became data, evidence that would eventually expose her and restore the balance that had been skewed for far too long. The tension in these days wasn't just external. It was internal, a constant push and pull between anger, restraint, and the drive for vindication. The more I watched, the more I saw how deeply her lies had infiltrated our family dynamic. Cousins who had once looked to me for guidance now hesitated, unsure which version of the story to believe. Friends who had supported me found themselves caught in her web of influence, unsure whom to trust. Even my parents, well-intentioned but easily swayed, were not immune to her skillful manipulation. Every incident, every micro-interaction reinforced the stakes. This was no longer a personal slight. It was a social battlefield, and the consequences extended far beyond my own humiliation. It wasn't just about me anymore. The more I observed, the more I realized that, unchecked, her deceit would continue to shape perceptions and control narratives, not just about me, but about anyone who might challenge her. The frustration became a mixture of anger and strategy. I could not allow her to continue undermining not only me, but the entire truth within our family. The more desperate she appeared to maintain control, the more opportunities I found to lay the groundwork for her eventual exposure. Every subtle slip, every overconfident smile was a thread I could tug at, a small opening to turn the tide. Despite my careful strategies, the emotional strain was undeniable. There were moments when the weight of her manipulation felt suffocating. I would lie awake at night, reliving interactions, wondering if anyone would ever see the truth. Anger flared, humiliation burned, and for the first time, I felt the real depth of isolation her lies had caused. But within that darkness, a spark of determination glowed brighter than ever. I would not allow these lies to define me. I would not let her arrogance and control remain unchallenged. As the days stretched on, the psychological warfare continued to escalate. Subtle digs, pointed jokes, and sly insinuations became the currency of power between us. She thrived on the discomfort she generated, feeding off the uncertainty and hesitation of others. And yet, every attempt she made to assert dominance only strengthened my resolve. I began to see the patterns clearly, the timing of her statements, the way she framed my actions, the allies she cultivated. All of it was predictable. And if it was predictable, it could be countered. Slowly, methodically, I was turning the battlefield in my mind, preparing for the inevitable confrontation that would demand everything I had learned. By the end of these weeks, the emotional tension had reached a near breaking point. Frustration, humiliation, and simmering anger intermingled with a growing clarity of purpose. I was no longer merely reacting. I was planning, observing, and preparing for the precise moment when her deceit would be revealed. The contrast between her apparent invincibility and my hidden strength had never been more stark. And as the mounting pressure threatened to reach a tipping point, I knew that the next phase was approaching, the moment when the emotional strain would force a confrontation, and the game would shift irrevocably in my favor. It all came crashing down one evening, in the quiet of my room, away from the forced smiles and polite laughter of family gatherings. The weight of months of manipulation, deception, and humiliation pressed on me like a vice. I could no longer pretend that it was just a game, just harmless sibling rivalry. Each lie my sister had told, each whisper that turned friends and family against me, had accumulated into a heavy, suffocating burden. My chest ached, my hands trembled, and for the first time I felt the full extent of helplessness. The raw, gut-wrenching sensation of being trapped in someone else's narrative. I replayed every interaction, every dinner, every seemingly casual conversation, and the pattern was undeniable. She had orchestrated this entire web with precision, knowing exactly how to undermine me without ever appearing overtly cruel. The skill and cunning she wielded had left me feeling small, invisible, and powerless. I remembered the laughter that had followed her twisted stories, the subtle nods from family members, the way even friends seemed uncertain which version of events to believe. All of it, meticulously calculated to erode my credibility, my confidence, my very sense of self. Despair rose like a storm inside me, hot and relentless. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to expose her in the moment, but fear and restraint held me back. I knew that reacting impulsively would only give her the upper hand, would allow her to twist the truth even further. Yet every second of silence felt like surrender, a passive acceptance of humiliation I refused to endure any longer. I felt the edges of my patience fraying, the boundary between restraint and rage disappearing. The helplessness I had tolerated for so long became unbearable, demanding action, demanding strategy, demanding change. And then, something shifted. Amid the despair, a spark of clarity emerged, sharp and bright. I realized that power had always been within my grasp, but it required patience, observation, and planning. My sister's confidence, her apparent invincibility, was built entirely on perception. She relied on appearances, on controlling what others saw and believed. And if perception could be manipulated in her favor, it could also be controlled against her. The helplessness that had plagued me transformed into a different energy, a quiet, focused empowerment that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. I began to envision the steps I could take, each move carefully calculated to reclaim control. No longer would I allow myself to be a passive participant in her narrative. Every whisper, every false story, every casual smear of my reputation would be met with precision, with timing, with undeniable truth. I understood now that the storm of anger and despair was not a weakness. It was a signal, a catalyst, a force that could be harnessed into strategy. The helpless child who had endured subtle cruelties for years was giving way to someone who understood the rules of this psychological battlefield. The intensity of my emotions was transformative. Where once I had felt small and powerless, now I felt the beginnings of authority over my own story. The contrast between the person I had been and the person I was becoming could not have been more stark. Helplessness gave way to calculation, humiliation transformed into resolve, and despair ignited a burning determination. I recognized the power of timing, the significance of observation, and the value of subtlety. Each lie she had told became a potential tool. Each misstep on her part a future opportunity to tip the scales. Even as I plotted, I could feel the lingering pain of betrayal, the sting of years spent in her shadow. My anger was still raw, a vivid reminder of every insult, every manipulation, every moment my integrity had been questioned. But now it was tempered by purpose. The fury that had once threatened to consume me became fuel, powering the meticulous plan that was beginning to take shape. Every sleepless night, every pang of humiliation, every whisper of doubt from family members contributed to my growing understanding of the battlefield and my role in it. In the solitude of that room, I made a decision. I would not be broken. I would not allow her to define my reputation, to control the narrative, or to continue wielding power over me. The emotional breaking point had been reached, and from it, a new force emerged. I would confront the lies, expose the truth, and reclaim not only my dignity, but the respect that had been denied to me for years. This was no longer a matter of reacting to her deception. It was about orchestrating a reversal so complete, so undeniable, that her control would shatter in an instant. The stakes were clear. This was not just about a single lie, a single humiliation, or a single dinner conversation. This was about years of manipulation, favoritism, and misrepresentation finally being challenged and corrected. The breaking point had revealed both the depth of the betrayal and the strength hidden within me. The transformation was profound. Helplessness had evolved into strategic empowerment, despair into determination, and humiliation into a plan that would ultimately change everything. As I lay there, heart still racing and mind sharp with purpose, I understood that the next steps were critical. The emotional storm had revealed the path forward, and the twist that would expose her deception loomed closer with every calculated move I began to consider. What had once seemed insurmountable now felt conquerable. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and I was ready. The stage was set for the truth to finally emerge, and for the balance of power to shift forever. The revelation didn't come in a shout or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet it carried the weight of a hurricane. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, observing patterns, and quietly documenting every lie, every manipulation, every subtle misrepresentation my sister had used to undermine me. What I held now wasn't just proof, it was irrefutable, undeniable, and devastating. Every whispered rumor she had spun, every casual joke meant to humiliate me, every family member she had subtly influenced was suddenly vulnerable to the truth. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. The power had shifted. I remembered the casual confidence she carried into every room, the way she had always assumed control, assumed authority over perceptions, assumed her lies would never be questioned. That arrogance had been her greatest weapon, and now, unknowingly, it was her weakness. I had spent months turning the tables, collecting fragments of evidence she thought insignificant, messages she had deleted but were retrievable, conversations she had recorded unwittingly, and the subtle inconsistencies she had left in her stories that, when pieced together, revealed the full tapestry of deceit. Each thread strengthened my position. Each contradiction amplified her vulnerability. The moment of triumph began to crystallize in my mind. I could see it vividly. Her poised, confident smile faltering as the truth emerged, as every friend, cousin, and parent saw the reality behind her carefully constructed facade. I could almost hear the gasp, the stuttered apologies, the stunned silence that would follow. The contrast was intoxicating. Where she had once appeared untouchable, the deception now left her exposed. Where she had relied on charm and manipulation, I relied on patience, observation, and evidence. Every ounce of humiliation she had inflicted on me now had a chance to rebound tenfold. I didn't rush the moment. Timing was everything. I knew that a premature reveal would allow her to salvage her narrative, twist the story, and maintain the illusion of control. Instead, I orchestrated small, subtle cues that seeded doubt in the minds of those around her. A casual mention here, a pointed question there, hints that suggested discrepancies without fully disclosing the truth. Every flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of friends and family was a spark, a tiny fissure in the armor of her arrogance. And as those fissures widened, I prepared to strike with the full force of the evidence I had meticulously compiled. The emotional tension was unbearable, but in that tension, I felt vindication brewing. For months, I had endured humiliation, manipulation, and the silent questioning of my integrity. Now the roles were reversing. I could feel the invisible scales tipping, the balance of power shifting, as I moved closer to the moment where her lies would be laid bare. The suspense was almost unbearable, a tightrope walk between revelation and disaster, but I knew that the careful patience of prior weeks had set the stage for a decisive and undeniable victory. And then the first crack appeared. During a casual conversation, I casually referenced a fact she had denied, one that aligned perfectly with the evidence I had gathered. Her eyes flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible shift in confidence. I saw the subtle tension in her jaw, the slight hesitation before she spoke, the nervous laugh that betrayed a crack in her armor. The room had not yet fully registered it, but I knew that seed of doubt had been planted. Every calculated detail I had observed and documented now began to converge toward a tipping point, where her carefully maintained narrative would collapse under the weight of truth. The more I watched, the more I realized that the narrative she had constructed around me was built entirely on assumptions and trust. Trust she had manipulated. And trust, once fractured, cannot easily be repaired. Each piece of evidence I had collected, once revealed, would act like a mirror, reflecting not just the truth about her lies, but the audacity of her manipulation. The very people she had charmed, the very family members she had convinced of her version of events, would now see the stark contrast between appearance and reality, arrogance and truth, deceit and vindication. By the time the dinner arrived, the one that would become the stage for the ultimate confrontation, I was ready. I could sense it in the subtle glances of family members who had already begun questioning her stories, the hesitation in their laughter, the faint uncertainty in their nods. My hands were steady, my mind focused, my resolve unshakable. Where she had relied on control and confidence, I had cultivated patience and evidence. Where she had thrived on perception, I thrived on truth. And as I stepped into that room, I knew the moment had arrived. The twist was no longer theoretical, no longer hidden. It was real, immediate, and unstoppable. The secret I carried was more than just information. It was power. It was a weapon of precision, a vindication of every slight, every humiliation, every whispered doubt she had orchestrated over the years. And as I prepared to reveal it, I felt an extraordinary mixture of triumph and calm certainty. The stage was perfectly set, and the contrast could not be more vivid. Her arrogance poised against my quiet, undeniable empowerment. In that room, everything would change. The lies that had governed the family for so long were about to be dismantled, and the truth would finally demand its place. The night of the family gathering arrived with a tension so thick it seemed to press against every wall. Every breath, every glance exchanged across the room. I walked in with a steady calm that belied the storm inside me. Months of careful observation, subtle maneuvering, and patient collection of evidence had led to this single moment. The contrast could not have been more striking. My sister, radiant with her usual confidence, smiling and chatting as though she controlled the entire room, and me quietly poised, carrying the weight of truth that would unravel everything she had built. The air itself seemed charged, as if everyone could feel, even unconsciously, that this gathering was about to become unforgettable. The evening began innocuously, with laughter and casual conversation, but I could see the cracks forming already. Family members exchanged glances, hesitation flickering in their eyes as they listened to her tell her stories. I observed quietly, noting each subtle sign: the hesitation in a cousin's laugh, the raised eyebrow of an uncle, the fleeting doubt in my parents' expressions. Every small cue was a sign that the web she had spun was starting to fray. And in that moment, I felt a rush of empowerment. I was no longer merely reacting, I was orchestrating, guiding the energy of the room toward the inevitable revelation. The confrontation began subtly. She told a story, one she had perfected over months, painting me in a negative light, embellishing the past with casual cruelty. I let her speak, letting the tension build, letting the room hang on her every word. I smiled politely, nodding at the right moments, letting her arrogance swell. And then, at the precise moment, I spoke. Calmly, firmly, and with evidence in hand, I contradicted her, pointing out specific inconsistencies, referencing documented proof that she had assumed would remain hidden. The room fell silent. Laughter stopped midair, conversations froze, and all eyes turned toward the two of us. The contrast between her shock and my composed confidence was immediate and electric. Her smile faltered, her voice wavering as she attempted to regain control. "That's not what happened," she stammered, but the words were hollow, lacking conviction. The evidence I presented was irrefutable. Messages, emails, and corroborating details that aligned perfectly with the truth. Every attempt she made to twist the narrative back in her favor was met with calm, clear facts, and the room absorbed them like a revelation. I could see the disbelief spreading, not just in her expression but in the expressions of everyone around her. She had underestimated not only my intelligence, but my patience, my determination, and my ability to wield the truth with precision. As I laid out the evidence piece by piece, the emotional atmosphere shifted dramatically. The energy in the room transformed from polite curiosity to intense engagement, and finally, to a charged awareness that the deception had been exposed. My sister, who had once commanded the room with effortless authority, now shrank under the weight of the truth. Her arrogance, her manipulation, her carefully maintained image, all of it crumbled before the undeniable facts. I could feel the emotional payoff surge through me, a mixture of vindication, relief, and quiet triumph. Each word I spoke, each document I revealed, reinforced the stark contrast between her past dominance and my present empowerment. The humiliation for her was total. Friends, cousins, and even parents who had unconsciously supported her narrative now faced the undeniable truth. Their reactions varied: shock, confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning recognition of the scope of her deceit. She fumbled, attempting to explain, to justify, to charm her way back into credibility, but it was too late. The careful construction of her lies had collapsed, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and, for the first time, powerless. The contrast could not have been more vivid. The sister who once seemed untouchable now stood stripped of control, while I, once humiliated and underestimated, stood steady, composed, and undeniably triumphant. The room held its breath as I continued, methodically, connecting the dots, presenting the evidence in a narrative that left no room for doubt. I emphasized not only the lies themselves, but the impact they had on relationships, reputations, and trust within the family. Every smile that faltered, every glance that flickered, every hesitant nod reinforced the reality that she could no longer manipulate perception. I had transformed months of suffering into strategy, months of humiliation into empowerment, and now, in this singular moment, the payoff was complete. The emotional intensity reached a peak as she attempted a final defense. Her voice shook, her hands trembled, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes that she had so often inspired in me. The contrast was stark. Where she had previously exuded control, now she exuded vulnerability. Where I had once felt powerless, now I commanded the room with quiet authority. The catharsis was profound, a release of months of pent-up frustration, anger, and despair. Each family member absorbed the truth in their own way. But the collective realization was unmistakable. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. By the end of the confrontation, the energy in the room had transformed completely. My sister, humbled and exposed, had no recourse. I had reclaimed not only my reputation but my authority within the family. The empowerment I felt was deep and undeniable, a validation of both my patience and strategic foresight. Where once I had been a passive victim, I now stood as the orchestrator of truth, the force that had dismantled years of manipulation and deceit. The contrast between past and present, humiliation and triumph, deception and clarity, was complete and irreversible. And as the room began to settle, conversations shifting cautiously back toward normalcy, I realized that this confrontation had done more than just reveal the truth. It had changed the dynamics of the entire family. The relationships, the perceptions, the hierarchy, all had been altered. The aftermath was inevitable, and I could sense it beginning to unfold. The subtle apologies, the reassessments, the quiet acknowledgments of my integrity. The stage had been set for reflection, for justice, and for the final resolution of a long-standing imbalance of power. The day after the confrontation, the house felt different, almost unrecognizable. The air was lighter, charged not with tension, but with a sense of truth finally settling in. I moved through the rooms with a quiet confidence that had been absent for years, sensing the subtle changes in how family members regarded me. Their eyes no longer carried doubt or hesitation. There was a new recognition, an acknowledgement that the person they had underestimated was not only capable but formidable. The contrast was stark, the same house, the same people, but the dynamics had shifted completely. I was no longer invisible. Small gestures reflected this transformation in ways both subtle and profound. My parents, who had once glanced past me in favor of my sister's charm, now listened attentively to my words, valuing my perspective. Cousins who had hesitated to trust me before now sought my opinion on matters both trivial and significant. Even friends who had been caught between loyalty and uncertainty now approached me with renewed confidence, their trust solidified by the undeniable truth I had revealed. Each interaction reinforced the sense that my dignity had been restored, that the narrative I had fought to reclaim was now firmly in my hands. The relief I felt was overwhelming, yet tempered by the awareness of the journey it had taken to get here. For years, I had endured subtle manipulations, quiet humiliations, and the constant undermining of my credibility. Those experiences, once sources of frustration and pain, now seemed like the crucible that had forged my resolve. The emotional weight I had carried for so long had transformed into a reservoir of strength. The triumph was not only in the confrontation itself, but in the endurance, patience, and strategic foresight that had brought me to this moment. Family dynamics had shifted in ways that were both immediate and lasting. My sister, humbled and forced to reckon with her actions, no longer held the automatic sway she once had. Where arrogance and deception had once dominated, there was now accountability and awareness. Conversations that might have been colored by her manipulation were now grounded in truth. She still existed within the family, but the power she wielded had been dismantled, and the hierarchy that had left me feeling small had been rebalanced. The contrast between her previous dominance and the present equilibrium was undeniable and satisfying. As I navigated this new dynamic, I also noticed how others began to mirror my approach. Family members who had once been passive or hesitant were now more willing to engage openly, to question, and to consider perspectives they might have ignored before. My presence, once underestimated, now commanded a subtle authority. The recognition was not about dominance for its own sake, but about respect, earned through patience, strategy, and unwavering adherence to truth. I realized that the empowerment I felt extended beyond my own victory. It had subtly influenced the environment around me, encouraging honesty, integrity, and accountability within the family. The triumph was deeply personal as well. I no longer carried the weight of humiliation or the quiet anxiety of being misrepresented. Each interaction was now an opportunity to reinforce the respect I had fought so hard to reclaim. I could speak freely, laugh without hesitation, and participate without the shadow of doubt clouding my presence. The relief was not fleeting. It was an enduring shift in how I perceived myself and how I was perceived by those around me. I had reclaimed not only my reputation, but my sense of self-worth, and that victory felt monumental. Even as the immediate aftermath unfolded, I knew the lessons of this experience would resonate far beyond these walls. The contrast between the person I had been, timid, overlooked, and misrepresented, and the person I had become, confident, strategic, and respected, was undeniable. That transformation was proof not only of the power of truth, but also of the importance of patience, observation, and resilience. The resolution was not simply about correcting a past wrong. It was about establishing a foundation for lasting respect, influence, and integrity within the family and within myself. In the quiet moments, when the house settled and the conversation slowed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The humiliation, the betrayal, and the tension had been intense, but they had forged the strength I now wielded. The reconciliation of family dynamics, the restoration of dignity, and the acknowledgement of my true self were victories that no one could take away. The room that had once felt constricting, heavy with unspoken judgments, now seemed expansive, filled with possibility. I was finally seen, fully recognized, and undeniably empowered. The echoes of that dinner confrontation lingered long after the plates were cleared and the final words were spoken. The silence that followed wasn't the uneasy, heavy kind I had grown used to over the years. It was a silence that carried weight, yes, but also recognition. For once, eyes that had previously slid past me without notice seemed to rest, and stay, and truly see me. I had spent years questioning my own worth under the shadow of my sister's lies. Years of swallowing words, of letting manipulation paint me as something I wasn't, of carrying humiliation in quiet. But now, the truth had cracked through like sunlight spilling into a darkened room. I felt changed. Not because my family suddenly applauded me, but because I had finally claimed my own narrative. Looking back, I realized the real betrayal wasn't just her lies. It was my silence. I had given her space to weave stories, to perform control, to tighten her grip on how others saw me. And though her deception stung, what hurt most was how long I let myself believe I had no power to challenge it. That belief was gone now. The days that followed were quieter, almost anticlimactic. My sister avoided me, her once confident voice reduced to clipped words and nervous glances. Family members tread carefully, some still uncertain how to balance years of habit with the reality laid bare. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't need them. What I needed was already mine: dignity, respect, and the certainty that I could no longer be erased. I found myself replaying the dinner in my mind, not with bitterness, but with a strange sense of gratitude. As painful as it had been to endure the lies, perhaps I needed to reach that breaking point to step into my own strength. Betrayal had forced me to sharpen my edges, to shed the skin of invisibility I'd been hiding in. Sitting with those reflections, I understood something even deeper. Vindication doesn't come from humiliating someone else, even if they deserve it. It comes from refusing to let their version of you become the truth. My sister's lies no longer defined me, and that was victory enough. There's a bittersweetness in that realization. I can't rewrite the years I lost, the moments where my silence cost me more than I care to admit. But I can own what comes next. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone tries to shrink me with lies, I'll remember the night I stood tall at the dinner table, the night I refused to be erased. In the end, I walked away not as the victim of my sister's cruelty, but as someone who had finally reclaimed their voice. And that voice, steady, unshaken, and mine, was louder than any lie she could ever tell. When I think back to that night, I don't just remember the lies or the humiliation, or even the confrontation. I remember the moment I chose to stand in my truth. For years, I let someone else write my story, twist it, stain it, shrink me. But in reclaiming it, I learned the most important lesson of all. Nobody holds the pen but me. If you've ever been betrayed, silenced, or underestimated, know this: your worth isn't defined by their lies. It's defined by the strength you find in yourself when you finally decide enough is enough. What would you do if this happened to you? Comment below. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for more. See you in the next video.